tardes, amigas y amigos. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My watch keeps slipping and I have to be on time for Susie here. Thank you so very much to the kind invitation. Es un gran placer, un enorme privilegio. I have learned a lot here this morning about what brings you together. And I want to commend you on the fact that you take time out of your schedules and busy lives to come here and innovate, be creative. I hope we fit John's definitions in terms of the industry that you all work in. On innovation and in imagination, let me propose the thesis that perhaps the Industrial Revolution, which is now about 200 years old, and in which we have been living, conducting business, and completely immersed, is coming to an end. And that perhaps, with innovation, imagination, leadership, and courage, we have the tremendous opportunity, as a matter of fact, the great privilege, to shape a new era, something after the Industrial Revolution. Greater well-being, much more happiness, much more inclusive than these 200 years have been. Something which would tackle head-on two of the big challenges I feel we have in the world today. One being the challenge posed by climate change, for the first time ever in humanity facing it. And the second one, the challenge which Philippe mentioned in his opening comments of this morning, the challenge of growing inequality and poverty. And let me propose in that same direction that today, with the economic and technological wherewithal that we have created, we have the ability to do something on the climate change front and do something on the inequality front by moving our global economy to a low carbon footprint. In this proposition, allow me to take a bird's eye view of the last 15 years, where we're coming from, and the next 15 years, where we could be going. So the last 15 years, up until about 2007, the world enjoyed over a decade of enormous global prosperity. This whole movement of globalization had the center, the developed nations, and the periphery, the developing nations, growing for the first time ever at figures measured in economic terms that we had never known before. You are familiar with the growth, the tremendous growth of that decade plus here in the US and in Europe. China grew over 10%. Latin America grew between 6 and 7% on average. Even Africa grew 5% average during that period of time. Globalization and that growth, although it was not completely inclusive, brought millions of peoples out of poverty. And a new middle class emerged of at least 300 million consumers in China and 200 million consumers in India, which I will come back to in a few minutes. If a Martian had been observing this period of time, he probably could have said something like, interesting what Homo sapiens is doing on Earth. They have put together a giant factory in the East, mainly around China, with a giant consumer in the West, mainly around the United States, and in the middle, everybody is doing business and doing much better than ever. Then came the crisis, from 2008 to the present. All of a sudden, we resurrected Keynes because we were going to spend our way out of the crisis. And although we have not achieved that, what we have achieved are tremendous fiscal deficits that are burdening our future growth. Almost 10% in the US, almost 11% on average in Europe. When I was in government in the past century, any country that dared to have 3% GDP as its deficit had the World Bank, the IMF, the intergovernmental development agencies, the development banks around the world, all over its case. How would you dare have a deficit of 3%? And now 10% and 11% have become the norm. Well, we all follow the discussion amongst economists as to how we're going to come out of the crisis. Some say the crisis is U-shaped. We will come out as we went in. Other economists say it is V-shaped. Still others more recently have been saying it is W-shaped with a double dip. And I read one economist a few days ago saying that actually the recovery would have the same way as the sign of a square root. You know, the sign of a square root, in, out, and then very level. My conclusion is that economists have run out of letters in the alphabet to describe the recovery, and now we're moving into something else. My conclusion are threefold. First, getting out of where we are is going to be a much slower process than many people believe. Secondly, I'm concerned about the levels of unemployment. Forget the deficit. Look at the levels of unemployment. 8.1% in the US, 10.7% average in Europe, with countries like Spain, where unemployment in the ages of between 18 and 30 are 40%. 35% in Middle Eastern countries. And then we ask ourselves why the uproar. Then we ask ourselves why the indignados that Philippe mentioned this morning in his presentation. My fear is that unless we're able to rekindle the economy in a sustainable way, we're about to lose a generation. A generation that has gone to school with a tremendous amount of effort on themselves, their parents, their families, and now are looking for jobs they can't find. Eso no puede ser. That cannot be in the day and age in which we live. I'm also concerned about the fact that I see governments around the world trying to get us out of this by more of the same. Sin imaginación, with no imagination, with no imagination. Almost as if we were rearranging the chairs on the deck of the Titanic, without taking into consideration that there are three fundamental shifts here that we should be aware of, which also open up great opportunities if we have the leadership and courage to innovate and imagine what a new future could be like. These three profound structural challenges are the following. The first one Philippe touched on briefly this morning. We live in a world with planetary limits. And perhaps we were never, ever so aware of that as we are beginning to be today. It took us 10,000 generations to reach 1 billion people on Earth around 1825. Then only 100 years to reach 2 billion around 1925. 75 more years to go up to 6 billion around the turn of the century. Today we're 7 and looking at 9 by the year 2050. With a pattern of consumption that does not correspond to our planetary limits, the way we consume and we produce today. Example, 3 years ago, China became the first market for the selling of vehicles. 3 years ago, China, at that point in time being the #1 market in the world, had, on average, 140 vehicles per 1,000 citizens. The US has 920 vehicles per 1,000 citizens. Europe, about 620. If the model of transportation is going to be the one we know here, and India is coming up after China, we need about another 4 planets for the steel, the aluminum, the rubber, everything that goes into manufacturing vehicles as we know them today. Bob Zoellick is stepping down from the World Bank in these days. If he was here in the room, if Susie had brought him in the room, I'm sure he would have been here to begin with, but if he was here in the room with us and we asked him, Bob, fast forward the movie of the World Bank and declare success, declare victory, something that would have been achieved where you can say, we have accomplished our mission in the World Bank and we can go back home. He would have probably, in a much more articulate way, have said something more or less like 6 billion people have the same level of well-being that 1 billion of us already have. So the well-being we need to achieve, the pattern of consumption with respect to our planetary limits needs to be transformed. And that is a tremendous opportunity for innovation, for changing business models, and for rethinking things in a completely different way. The second profound structural change is energy. Oil has been underpriced forever. In the last 20 years, supply has shifted from being mainly centered in OECD countries towards countries in the periphery that are much more unstable. Today, the majority of our oil comes from Russia, the Middle East, Africa, and Venezuela. Not your most stable parts on the world. And secondly, the extractive companies that used to extract most of the oil in the OECD nations used to be publicly traded corporations with good governance, good bylaws, are today mainly companies owned by governments with which oil becomes much more likely to be used as an instrument or a weapon of global politics. Oil prices today are around $100 a barrel mark. Supply and demand is at a point of equilibrium of about 78 or 79 million barrels per day. There is not a person on the planet, not even the Martian, that would say we have capacity today to extract over 90 million barrels a day. And with just a small uptake in the economy, we would be over the 90 million. Think of what that does to energy prices. and to energy access for some of the countries that may not be able to afford it at the prices where energy would go. And the third profound structural change is our environment. 70% of carbon emissions come from energy. Today, 2012, as of March, the ratio of high temperatures reached around the world, record-breaking temperatures around the world, when compared to low temperatures that set a record around the world, was 30-1. High temperatures versus low temperatures. There is a scientific consensus around this topic. Yes, there is a dissenting voice, which is always healthy and always keeps us on our toes, and we should be respectful and mindful of. But over 4,000 scientists signed the last the last UNIFCCC report. Math, in Spanish we say, las matemáticas no mienten. Math does not lie. At the outset of the Industrial Revolution, we had 280 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. Today, almost 200 years later, we have 385. We are accumulating, product of our development style, another 3 parts per million. So 90 years to the end of the century is 90 times 3, 270, plus 385, 655 parts per million. Scientists, those 4,000 scientists, say to us that if we go over 450 parts per million, there is no guarantee that we will not go over 2 degrees centigrade change of temperature. At 655 parts per million, we have a 50% chance of achieving temperature changes of plus and minus, because climate change is all about higher temperatures in some places and lower temperatures in others, of 5 degrees centigrades. Now, the last time we had plus 5 degrees centigrades was about 3 million years ago. Alligators were swimming in the North Pole. And the last time we had minus 5 degrees centigrades was only 10,000 years ago in the last ice age. So because of those 3 major fundamental shifts and their systemic connections, which make this a much more complicated equation, as Philippe addressed this morning, we need to think out of the box. And to move, I would propose, respectfully, in the direction of a low-carbon economy, which is the economic opportunity of our generations. More employment, changed business models, much more investment, and much more inclusiveness in everything that we do going forward. In this, the private sector is in the driving seat. Full 50% of carbon emissions today can be reduced without any need for further governmental agreements or intergovernmental processes. And that 50% is what we work with at the Carbon War Room. The name comes from Churchill's idea back in World War II that to win the war he needed to organize a carbon war room, a war room that would organize information flows and allow decision-making processes to go forward in a better way. The brainchild of Sir Richard Branson and a small group of global entrepreneurs, today we identify sectors of the global economy whereby reinventing business models or being hopefully creative and innovative with respect to what we do in them, we can reduce carbon emissions while making it a good business opportunity. If we can't make this a good business opportunity, we will never be able to attract to this space the leadership, the intellect, the creativity, the entrepreneurship, and the resources that we need in order to be successful in this quest. So some examples of what we're already doing. Take shipping. About 100,000 ships out there sailing the world's oceans. About 75,000 of them are overfishing, depleting our fish stock. That's a different story for another day. The balance is doing the world's trade. You take the 15,000 largest of those ships that are doing the world's trade, and if you combined their carbon emissions, they would be equivalent to the 6th nation emitter in the world. So their combined carbon emissions would be between Japan and Germany. Now you take one of these ships, you put it up on a dry dock. Dry docks are usually in depressed areas. So you begin by creating jobs where jobs need to be created. You invest and deploy 3 to 4 million per ship of off-the-shelf technologies. We're not talking about the sails here. That's still experimental. No, we're talking about technologies that have been tested. We help small technology companies that are trying to break through with new products. We roll that ship off the dry dock 6 weeks later, and it's consuming 25 to 30% less energy, which is 25 to 30% less carbon emissions. Doing good business, creating jobs, deploying technologies, and the byproduct is less carbon emissions. Just changing the paint on the hull of the ship for modern-day elastic paints reduces the coefficient of drag by 10%. The payback on the paint is 10 months. The payback on the complete suite of technologies you put on the ship is less than 36 months. Tremendous opportunity in the world of today. Buildings. With over 50% of the world's population living in buildings, buildings have become large emitters of carbon. Air conditioning, pumps, heating, lighting, fixtures, everything. Well, there's a tremendous amount that can be done in buildings. So last September, we launched a consortium of an engineering company that would come in here and look at this building and say to the Aspen Institute, on this building, we could retrofit it in X, Y, Y form, and we could reduce energy demand by 20%. That engineering company in this consortium we launched is Lockheed Martin. Then comes in an insurance company, because we needed to reconfigure and see how we work the finances on this. An insurance company walks in when Lockheed Martin walks out, and they review what's been done and say, I agree with that was just said by Lockheed Martin, and I'll write an insurance policy against that. That insurance company is underwritten by Hanover Re. Then you have a bank who now sees a business opportunity, and by the way, he has an insurance group that will write what in a sense becomes a guarantee that there's going to be 20% reduction to pay for the retrofitting, and that bank is Barclays. And then you have the companies that roll up with the white vans, young people in overalls, and start doing the overhauling. So you're generating jobs. In countries where there was a large construction boom, you're retraining people to do something that they are already very familiar with, which is construction, which is redoing things that they can do. And that consortium was launched, putting $650 million on the table by Barclays, because they see the economic opportunity. Third and last example, island nations. I arrived in Denver on Friday after a deal day that we put together in New York with the Prime Minister of Aruba and 25 corporations in the room, besides ourselves at the Carbon War Room, looking at how to take Aruba off fossil fuels. Most island nations around the world today are paying. Sonu, I'll let you answer that. And I'll let you carry on with this with this opportunity, because we were just at the table discussing it. He has the facts clear from the Maldives. You all know Sonu, who is the chairman, CEO, and founder of Six Senses, as well as Soneva. So tell us your story. Come up here, because I need everybody to listen to this.
Good afternoon. In the Maldives at the moment, islands are powered by high RPM generators. It's costing resorts about 35 cents per kilowatt to generate electricity through diesel, the traditional diesel approach. There are 200 inhabited islands in the Maldives, and the government subsidizes energy. It's costing the government somewhere between, in their most efficient plant rooms, 40 cents per kilowatt, and in the more inefficient ones, 70 cents per kilowatt to generate electricity. We installed solar panels about 3 years ago at one of our resorts in the Maldives, Soneva Fushi, and we worked out that our costs, even if you took a reasonable cost of capital, we took a 15% cost of capital, which in a lot of parts of the world is considered expensive, we arrived at 30 cents per kilowatt. Since then, solar panel prices have dropped from $3,000 per kilowatt installed to $800. So the price of a solar panel has dropped to less than a third of what it was 3 years ago. And we're just about to embark on a megawatt of solar power capacity in the Maldives. We anticipate that that will cost us 20 cents. So the energy that we will be generating from our solar panels will cost 20 cents vis-a-vis 70 cents of the most inefficient sort of government generators on some of the islands. So a third of what the government are spending.
Thank you, Sonu. So the Prime Minister of Aruba is thinking like Sonu, and we had a deal day with 25 corporations figuring out how Aruba turns off the switch on fossil fuels and puts on the switch on renewables. Island nations are paying around the world today about 65, 70 cents per kilowatt in energy. At those prices, as we've just heard from Sonu, you don't need any subsidies, you don't need any additional things to happen for these islands to deploy renewables, some wind, mainly PV, solar, that will give them extraordinary amount of better quality energy at much lower prices, and therefore create much more competitive economies. And we could go on with other examples of the global economy where this is the case. 50% carbon emission reduction, making that to be a tremendous business opportunity. So, amigas y amigos, we go through life with a plan A, and then we think of a plan B, and sometimes even a plan C. When it comes to our home, there is no planet B. We need to get this one right. And we have the economic and technological wherewithal to start moving in that direction. We don't have all the answers to all the questions. These are uncharted waters we're navigating for the first time in the history of humanity. But we have enough terrain under the ground so that looking up at the stars and keeping our feet moving in the right direction, we can make a tremendous amount of progress. You are all agents of change with respect to the industry in which you work in. And your industry, I believe, is also very much an agent of change in terms of pursuing values which will become much dearer to us as humanity advances. The impact that you can make in this transformation is huge. And the world that you can help us shape is also a much better one. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you so much.